Let me start by saying hello and welcome. We're going to do a four-part series on Hebrews. And that four parts will be Hebrews 6, 7, 8, and 9. But we're going to start with a little bit of chapter 5, and we're going to end with a little bit of chapter 10. And Hebrews is a special book it was written 2,000 years ago. It has special meaning to the Christians of that era, that first century church. And if you study it like we've studied it, you'll see that it has special meaning for us as Christians, as believers. It has a special meaning in this year. This is 2021, has a special meaning to us because of what we've been going through as a nation since 2019 with COVID and with all the other stuff going on in the world. You'll see that has special meaning specifically for us as Christians in current day Christianity. Let me start with some background, and I'm going to use notes, by the way, because I'm not smart enough to remember this. So a little background on Hebrews. The book of Hebrews was written as a letter. In fact, if you read Hebrews, it's kind of funny. The last chapter is, in fact, effectively supposed to be the opening of the letter, but that's beside the point. Hebrews was written about 70 years after Christ's death and resurrection. And so what you've got here is a group of Christians who were largely Jewish. They certainly live in a Jewish community. And 70 years after Christ's death, they're Christians, but they're discouraged because Christ is not there for them. And they're wondering, well, what does the future hold? Worse, the Christians of that era are being persecuted. And so if you think about that, you've got the Roman Empire. They are persecuting Christians. And it's easier for these people who were Jewish to start thinking about, well, perhaps if I just behave Jewish, I won't be persecuted. And so there's a familiarity. Christ is gone, and their entire history and all their family are Jewish. And so if you think about that, these people have a familiarity, and they like the idea they can go back to those religious covenants and those religious rituals, and those things are very familiar. So that's who this is written for. As current day Christians, one of the questions we ask ourselves is the Bible still relevant to us? Well, think about this group of people who 70 years after Christ has died, they are discouraged because Christ is no longer there. They know he said he's coming back, but he's not back yet, and that's confusing. They're being persecuted, and they're wondering, should I just go back to what is familiar? And now today, here we are as Christians, and what is happening to us? Well, look at the world around us. The world is falling apart. We've all been sequestered. We're all in a place where we haven't been able to even be around people that we love and that love us. And Christians around the world are being persecuted to the point of death in some countries. So there is a reason perhaps for us to be discouraged, just like those first century Christians. Let me tell you the gist of Hebrews and get past the background. If you took Hebrews and put it all in a bundle, Hebrews is this: Jesus is better, Christ is supreme, he is completely sufficient for your salvation, and you need nothing else. He is the perfect revelation of God, and he's a reflection of God. He is the complete sacrifice for sin because he lived a sin-free life. And if you want to sum it up in one sentence, it's this: Christ is my only security in a changing world. So that's Hebrews in a nutshell. And so now let's get started studying Hebrews chapter 6. Let me start with this. Questions. Who are you? So let me tell you about me. As an example, I am a father, I am a son, I am a grandfather, a grandson, I am an employer, an employee. I'm a lot of different things. But so keep these questions in mind. Who are you? What is your job? What's your title? Everybody who works has a job. And in fact, even people who don't work have some sort of a job they do. But what is your title, and who gave you that title? By what authority did you get that title? What does your job entail? What are your duties? So with those questions, what if we should apply those to Jesus Christ himself? Let's ask ourselves those questions. Who is Jesus? So he was a carpenter's son. He was a carpenter himself. He was a teacher. He was a rabbi. He was a son of Mary and Joseph, and he was God's only son. So Jesus has a lot of character in who he is. He's not just a single thing. We have lots of things. But what is his current title? His current title is really clear. It's crystal clear in Hebrews. His current title is high priest. Well, that makes sense, but who gave him that title? You would think, well, somebody has to give a title, right? My title is let's say it's vice president of sales. The president had to give me the title. Who gave Jesus his title? Well, obviously God gave him that title. But you'll see furthermore, not only did he give them the title, but he did it with an oath. So when my boss gave me my title, he didn't say, by the way, I swear to you, whatever. He didn't swear to me that I have that title and that job forever, but we'll see later that God gave Jesus the title high priest, and he swore it with an oath that he was high priest forever. And then last question really is this: what does that job entail? What is the job of high priest that Jesus Christ has? And you'd think, oh, well, what does a high priest do? Well, in Hebrews, we'll see that the job of Jesus, his major duty, salvation, of course, for us, but his ongoing duty today and forever is intercession. So it's interesting that, and we'll see later as we wrap this chapter up, what intercession means and why it's important to me as a Christian. So the letter of the Hebrews, I told you we're going to start in chapter 6, but I want to back up to chapter 5 because we've been refining who Jesus is in chapters 1 through 5 and telling you who he's better than. He's better than angels, better than Moses. But now we're getting into this, and it may seem strange to you that I'm backing up, but I need to back up to go forward. And here's why. If you look back to chapter 3 begins with this word, therefore. Chapter 4 begins with this word, therefore. And so let me read you chapter 3. Chapter 3, verse 1 says this: therefore, fix your thoughts on Jesus, our high priest. Well, that's interesting that now we've got this title of Jesus being introduced. In chapter 4, it begins with the word therefore. Therefore is used all throughout Hebrews. Chapter 4 begins, therefore, since the promise of entering his rest still stands, and it goes on to tell us how we can enter that rest. Then chapter 4, verse 14 reads like this: therefore, see how that word just is here. Therefore, since we have a great high priest who has ascended into heaven, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold firmly to the faith we possess. So, twice now, put yourself in the shoes of the audience, of the people who are hearing this for the first time. These people are hearing about words about Jesus, the high priest, and they know what a high priest is. How do they know? They know because they're Jewish. And the Jewish people, this is not a generic title. It's not like you're saying, well, that's someone's father or son. That's a generic title. This is a very specific title. And it has special meaning in Judaism that only the high priest had the right to go into the Holy of Holies. And so this high priest would once a year go into the Holy of Holies, make a blood sacrifice for his own sins first, and then for the sins of the people to make atonement for their sins. So this idea that they're being introduced to, and as first century Christians who come from a Jewish background, that there's this new person, Jesus Christ, who has dead and risen, is a high priest. You have to imagine their thinking is they're going into the Holy of Holies. He can go into the Holy of Holies. So calling Jesus a high priest is not lost on them. And it shouldn't be lost on us. It's the power in that term. All right, so continuing chapter 4. Chapter 4, verse 15. And I promise you I'm getting to chapter 6. I promise. It says this: for we do not have a high priest who is unable to empathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are, yet he did not sin. Let us then approach God's throne. Let us then approach God's throne of grace with confidence, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. Okay, 21, here we are. We all have needs. Every one of us have needs, and this tells us something for us, but more importantly, this is a revelation for the the Christians of this first century. Remember, Jewish background? Well, there is something that says in verse 15 here that is amazing, that changes everything. The first thing is that Jesus Christ is a high priest, but he is not a part of the Levite descendants. And we'll hear more about that shortly. But more importantly, they hear this phrase in verse 16, let us then approach God's throne. Well, they know that's unheard of. No one can approach God's throne. One person, the high priest, once a year, after fully cleansing, after sprinkling the blood over every single thing being used in the Holy of Holies, after being fully prepared, gets one time a year to go in and approach the throne of God there in the Holy of Holies to atone for sin. But here they're being told, we can approach the throne of God. Could you imagine being a first century believer and being told this? Well, guess what happened? They couldn't believe it. They're shocked. They're like, well, this makes no sense. But we are fortunate in that this author says, I know you can't understand that, but let me share more. He says this: Every high priest is selected among the people and is appointed. I'm sorry, this is chapter 5, verses 1 to 10. Every high priest is selected from among the people and is appointed to represent the people in matters related to God, to offer gifts and sacrifices for sin. He is able to deal gently with those who are ignorant and are going astray, since he himself is subject to weakness. This is why he has to offer sacrifices for his own sins as well as the sins of the people. No one takes this honor on himself, but he receives it when called by God, just as Aaron was. In the same way, Christ did not take on himself the glory of becoming a high priest, but God said to him, "You are my son, today I have become your father." And he says in another place, "You are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek." We'll have to deal with that question in a minute. During the days of Jesus' life on earth, he offered up prayers and petitions with fervent cries and tears to the one who could save him from death. And he was heard because of his reverent submission. Son though he was, he learned obedience from what he suffered, and once made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation for all who obey him, and was designated by God to be high priest in the order of Melchizedek. So, I love questions. Let me ask you a question. By whose authority did the priests get their titles and perform their duties? God did. God gave those priests, the Aaronic order, the Levites, they got that order from God himself. Jesus got the same order. The difference was that at the time of the letter of Hebrews, guess who was appointing the high priest? You would think it would be following the heredity and the generations of Levi, but that's not what was happening. The Romans were actually deciding who was going to be the high priest in the temple. And therefore, these were not men called of God. These were men called of Rome. So, do high priests sin? We just read that they do. Who makes sacrifices for the sins of the priest? Stay tuned, but they themselves make that sacrifice. And then another question. So, by whose authority was Jesus appointed a priest? Like Aaron, God, right? But there's a problem. God had decided 2,000 years ago that only descendants of Aaron could be in the priesthood. Jesus is a descendant of Judah in that line, not in the Levite. So Jesus isn't qualified to be a priest. He's not part of that. So how do we reconcile this confusion? This is confusing to me. I don't understand the Bible so hard. How do you reconcile that? So the easiest way to reconcile it is we have to jump over chapter 6 completely. Golly, I think I tricked you. Okay, so we're going to jump from here to chapter 7, because chapter 7 is where we understand more about why Jesus can even be qualified to be a priest. And so let me show you chapter 7. This is important because in chapter 7, it starts to sort of, it makes sense. Before that, I need to point one thing that caught my heart. In verse 7, this is chapter 5, verse 7, it said this. It said, fervent cries and tears. It talked about Jesus himself having fervent cries and tears. It says, he offered up prayers and petitions with fervent cries and tears. Any idea when that happened? I mean, think about that. 4 days before Jesus' death and resurrection. If you look in the book of Luke, in Luke 22, verses 41 to 44, we hear this. This is where Jesus had prayed. And he says this, he withdrew about a stone's throw beyond them, knelt down and prayed, "Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me, yet not my will, but yours be done." An angel from heaven appeared to him and strengthened him. And being in anguish, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat was like drops of blood falling to the ground. So when you read in Hebrews about Jesus praying fervently, I've prayed fervently. When my kids are sick and I couldn't do anything, we prayed fervently for them. But in this case, I've never prayed so fervently with cries and tears that I had drops of blood coming out of my skin. But Jesus did. So moving on, in verses 8 through 10, as we looked at that, though he was God's only son, he suffered. And this talks about that as he suffered, he learned obedience, and then he became our source of eternal salvation. In fact, in verse 10, it ends with something that hints to the answer of God's appointing Jesus as the priest, even though he's not a Levite. And it talks about this order of Melchizedek. And that's something we need to look at, and I'll try to do it quickly because I know I don't want this to take too much longer. But if you look at chapter 7, verses 1 through 4, it says this. This Melchizedek was king of Salem and priest of God's Most High. He met Abraham returning from the defeat of the kings and blessed him. And Abraham gave him a tenth of everything. First, the name Melchizedek means king of righteousness, and then also king of Salem means king of peace. Without father or mother, without genealogy, without being of days or end of life, resembling the Son of God, he remains a priest forever. Just think how great he was. Even the patriarch Abraham gave him a tenth of his plunder. So who was this guy? Who is Melchizedek? He shows up from nowhere. He has no beginning. He has no end. He's a priest. He's a priest forever. Something unusual there. In fact, it says there are many people who believe he was Jesus Christ. But I would tell you that you can't have Jesus Christ present and a priest forever, which we just heard. Jesus is a priest forever. And Melchizedek, who it says is a priest forever. You can't have them both, same time, same place, same person. Therefore, I'm telling you they're two different people. There's Melchizedek, who predated the law, continues as a priest forever. You have Jesus, who came after the law, died and was resurrected, was named by God as high priest, and continues. So we have two high priests. I don't understand it completely. Don't have to. Jesus saved me. I'll figure it out when I get to heaven. So again, I'm going to try to wrap this up quickly. As we read on, specifically in chapter 7, verses 13 through 17, it says this. He of whom these things are said belonged to a different tribe. This is talking about Jesus. And no one from that tribe has ever served at the altar. For it is clear that our Lord descended from Judah. And in regard to the tribe, Moses said nothing about priests. And what we have said is even more clear. If another priest like Melchizedek appears, one who has become a priest not on the basis of regulation as to his ancestry, but on the basis of the power of an indestructible life. For it is declared, you are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. And verse 13 makes it clear that Jesus came from a tribe that never served as priests. And he is a part of that indestructible life that is mentioned in these passages. In fact, verse 16 explains why Jesus can be a priest when it says, one who has become a priest not based on the regulation of ancestry. So Jesus, whom God appointed as high priest, did so not because of the Levites, but because he lived a sinless, indestructible life. Wrapping up, chapter 7 says this, chapter 7, verses 20 to 22. In fact, I mentioned to you in the beginning that Jesus was given the title of high priest, and it was done with an oath. Here's where that oath is mentioned. It says this, and it was not without an oath. Others became priests without an oath, but he became a priest with an oath when God said to him, the Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever. Because of this oath, Jesus has become the guarantor of a better covenant. There's nothing better than having the Son of God who will never die to be a guarantor of our better covenant, which is salvation through Christ. So I'm going to wrap it up. 3 more verses. Chapter 7, verses 25 to 28 reads like this. Therefore, he is able to save completely those who come to God through him, because he always lives to intercede for them. So remember back when I asked you, what role does the high priest play? That role is very clear. It says here, he is to intercede for them. Such a high priest truly meets our need. One who is holy, blameless, pure, set apart from sinners, exalted above the heavens. For the law appoints as high priests men in their weakness, but the oath which came after the law appointed the Son who has been made perfect forever. So final point. I started with, what is Jesus' role? What are his duties? And verse 25 tells us that. It says to intercede for them, but who is them? When it says them, first century Christians reading this are going, who's them? I mean, I know you wrote the letter to me because you wrote it to me, right? But who's this them? Super clear. By the way, it's us. Here's what it says. He therefore is able to save completely those who came to God through him, and he always lives to intercede for them. Them are those who came to God through Jesus Christ. So what better way to end with this summary? Jesus is the Son of God who is given a title by God himself of high priest. Best of all, that role is eternal, and his duty is to intercede for me every day for the rest of eternity for my needs. I can't imagine anything more humbling than to know that Jesus is interceding for me every day. I'll close with this. John Piper, a great theologian, has a quote I like using sometimes, and this is one that I think fits perfectly with Hebrews. It says this: "The Bible was not written as a self-help book or as a guide to our mental health. Though you may find help from it, the Bible was written to explain to us about the massive holiness of God." Man, what a great quote. See you in the next lesson.